Thank you, and thank you for Budapest Forum for inviting us, and thank you for our panelists for joining us today. First of all, I would like our panelists to reflect on Ambassador Pressman's words, specifically when he mentioned the advice that he received when he moved here to Budapest. Watch what the government does and not what the government says. I don't know, Nathalie, if you received the email that I sent you, the notes with the ambassador's words. But I would like to start first with Botond to reflect on Mr. Pressman's speech.
Thank you, Flóra. Greetings to all in the room or on the panel. I'm glad to share a few thoughts, though I took notes almost one page, so I will get maybe to one point. At the end of the speech, the ambassador was referring to how the corrosive effect of the words did change actually the behavior of the government. And I think we can very clearly delimit different phases of the apparent behavior of the government. How Orbán was talking and behaving before 2009, so the infamous meeting in St. Petersburg with the United Russia Party and Putin himself. How there was the silent preparation phase between 2010 and 14, so the second Orbán government, the preparation of the nuclear power plant enlargement treaty, and then 14 to 22, so the open pro-Russia period. And then there is the escalation phase after the breakout of the full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And I think it is important to see and define that there was an escalation in the openness of this relationship, to embrace this against the war, against the Chinese involvement in the war. And while we receive daily news almost about investigative pieces and reports, we feel a bit like cooked like the frog in the dish, that it's hard to tell that there was this point of tipping point, maybe a few weeks after 22 February, when this behavior truly changed and evolved, upgraded into something different. My last and second thought is, if I could have given an advice to the ambassador, to the incoming ambassador, I would have sent him one interview where the prime minister was talking about the difference, how he appreciates loyalty against institutions. He is talking openly about this. And I guess it is an important political characteristic of any leader in Europe. He is among the few who is open about that, and he is embracing loyalty over institutions, and we see the results.
Nathalie, how do you think this duality reflects in Hungary's foreign policy?
Well, again, I also have two reflections, really. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it is true in general, not just in this case, that at times speech and act don't coincide, and at times sort of bombastic speech is kind of, accompanied by under-delivery on act. However, I not only think it is right to look at speech as often a prelude to act, and in a sense a sort of indicator of what may happen, as indeed, it did happen, and as we've discussed. But I think there's also another aspect to this, which is the fact that speech is act. And I think this is really something that, particularly in the case of Hungary, and particularly in the case of Hungary, its role in the transatlantic, in Europe and the transatlantic partnership, but also in light of what is very clearly an ongoing, to use, Josep Borrell's phrase, battle of narratives going on. Speech is act. And so the minute in which Orbán is essentially, but not only by how he acts, but also by how he talks, he has essentially delineated a model that others may emulate. I guess, I may be, again, everyone is influenced by their own background, but I see what's happening in my own country, Italy, and there is very clearly the risk of an urbanization, basically, in other member states, including my own. And this has been a product, yes, on the one hand, of how Hungary has acted, but it has been very much a product of how Hungary has spoken. So I think there has been, in terms of both Hungary's European partners and partners in Washington, an underappreciation of just how corrosive that speech act is actually all about.
David?
Is this working? Okay, well, if I was to reflect on the ambassador's speech, I mean, I'm speaking as an American, and I was, I've been following Hungary, Orban, kind of since the beginning, or, since the second administration. I did a lot of work on what he was doing to the churches, his acts against he started discriminating against Ivani's church, 15 years ago. And my thought when I hear that speech, and I've been to Foggy Bottom. I talked to people in the State Department. I've been a guest in the embassy here. And my thought, honestly, is I'm thinking as American, why wasn't anyone in America talking like that 15 years ago or 10 years ago even? I mean, it took a very long time for the United States or U.S. administrations to figure it out, I guess. And I think at this point, I'm not sure it's kind of too late. I think if there had been tough talk like that, or even not quite as tough, but even some tougher talk from the United States 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, then it might have made a difference. At this point, things are so far gone, and that's my view, that a lot of that talk is, I just don't think it's going to have much of a consequence. That's my first thought. And the second thought would be, I mean, if I hear that speech as someone who cares about Hungary, and doesn't like Orban, I'm a Hungarian. I mean, it's this kind of scary speech because it's almost, it's got some close to threats, right? I mean, like things don't change. I don't know what the implications are going to be, but the relationship between Hungary and the United States is not going to continue like this. So it's if you're a Hungarian citizen and you like being allied with the United States and being part of the European Union and so on, that speech is disturbing if it really reflects U.S. policy. That was a tough speech. It would have been nice if someone from the United States had been talking like that 10 years ago. I think of course we hear that speech and one has to ask the question, and I'm sure Orban is thinking this is that, well, okay, the ambassador gave a tough speech, but he's a lot different than the previous ambassador. And how consistent is U.S. policy towards Hungary? Or after all, I mean, we get one ambassador who comes in here and talks a tough game, but there'll be another administration and it might be different. And of course, we know that one of the candidates, right? Depending on who wins the election, the direction and the shape of U.S. foreign policy and certainly policy towards Hungary will be a lot different. So the one thing I probably didn't, wasn't sure that ambassador said that I wasn't so sure about was that it's the relationship with the United States is sort of will remain the same, or he tried to downplay the significance of the election. And I think if Trump wins the election, then we know he won't be here, President won't be here, and there'll be a very different policy towards towards Hungary coming from the United States. That also undermines and undercuts the message that's coming from Pressman. And of course, the last point then is about this. When Orban says, "Look at what I do and not what I say," well, that's probably how he thinks. And he thinks the same thing about the United States. Well, look at what they do rather than what they say, because the ambassadors come through, change. And so he's probably, or I assume Orban's wondering, well, okay, what is the United States going to do rather than what Pressman's going to say? And it's true, it's not I don't think it's a smart policy, but he's clearly banking on a particular outcome. But when you don't have unanimity in the United States, you have a very, very divided attitudes towards foreign policy between the two parties. I think it's difficult for, I'm sure Orban is, well, let me see what happens with the next administration. So I think that also undercuts to a certain extent the effectiveness of Pressman's message.
Recently, we have seen the debate between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, which has attracted an extreme number of viewers, which is due to the fact that if we're looking at the polls, the outcome of Trump becoming president is just as likely as the other. And to dive into the main focus of our panel, I'd like to ask, how can Europe prepare for a second Trump presidency? Nathalie.
So I'll start off by saying one thing. Whereas in most places in the world, obviously, who wins the US election is consequential. Nowhere is it as consequential as it is in Europe. Essentially because, whereas on a structural level, you could say, well, we are already in the end of Pax Americana. We are already beyond our beloved liberal international order. The world has already moved, in a sense, from that point. And in a sense, there's a recognition of that, not only in the rest of the world, but also in America. But agency matters. And in a sense, the response to that structural change is diametrically different depending on who wins that election. So in a sense, the consequence of a Pax Americana under a Trump presidency is basically, doubling down on isolationism, on the prioritization of China, probably in particular, and in general. And this is connected to the isolationism, very little affection, in a sense, and interest in multilateralism and partnerships, beginning with Europe. In a sense, precisely the acknowledgement of that end of Pax Americana leads a President Harris eventually to double down on those partnerships and alliances, precisely as a way of redistributing, in a sense, responsibilities with allies and partners. So diametrically different effects, which are, obviously they affect various parts of the world, but they particularly affect Europe. I would say in kind of three dominant ways. The first, and probably in some respects most important, and this connects to the debate that we were just having a moment ago, it affects Europe because what happens to democracy in America is and will be hugely consequential with, in terms of what happens for democracy and liberal democracy in Europe. So it is very clear that if liberal democracy in the United States is to go or begin to go down the drain, especially at a time in which we are living now of what I would define as the second wave of nationalist populism in Europe, which, by the way, and this is perhaps something interesting to note, whereas when Trump came to power the first time, 2016, it caught Europe on a downwards, on the downward curve of its first wave of nationalist populism. Now that we are in the second wave, the US election happens at a time in which that curve is going up. So I think precisely for that reasons, it would have very different effects in terms of democracy in Europe. Second effect, obvious, which has to do with European security, Ukraine, diametrically different effects. And then, of course, the third impact has to do with the economy and trade and the sort of risk or rather threat of trade wars being reignited across the Atlantic. So very different effects. Now, let me close simply by saying that I think the paradox and perhaps the interest is that although the effects would be diametrically different, the policy recipe for Europe is exactly the same. That we have to double down on our democratic resilience, that we have to work on our competitiveness agenda, take the Draghi report and basically, that's what you have to do over the next 5 years. That we have to invest in our defense and assume greater responsibility in the defense of Ukraine. These three things are true regardless of who wins the US election. And I think the task now is to avoid ending up in a catch-22. What do I mean by this? Were Trump to be re-elected, we would probably be more likely to try and do the things that I just mentioned a moment ago, but less likely to succeed, right? Because in a sense, the impact that Trump would have would be devastating. The risk is that if we end up in a Harris win, which probably everyone in this room hopes that's the case, we may well be more likely to succeed, but less likely to try. And so I think it is important now to realize that if we, and of course we have no influence on who wins the US election, but if we do end up in a situation in which indeed Kamala Harris wins the next election, we escape that catch-22 and react as we would have done had Trump won, right? But with a far greater likelihood to actually deliver because we're going to have a friend in the White House.
David, what do you think a second term of Donald Trump could mean for transatlantic relations?
Well, the first, I mean, am I working? Is it working? Yeah. The first thing, of course, is one has to remember that we don't really, we shouldn't take the Trump winning the election as some foregone conclusion. I mean, it's at least 50-50. I mean, I tend to think there's a slight advantage for Harris, actually, but I guess we don't know. So, I mean, what Trump could certainly, it's not unthinkable, but we ought to keep that in mind. If Trump wins the election, I honestly, it's hard for me. I don't know exactly. I think that the most obvious implication is with the security guarantee that the United States provides to Europe, right? I mean, that even if Trump doesn't really pull out U.S. out of NATO, or he can't do that, or so forth, you know, I just don't think that Europe should feel comfortable relying on, you know, that security guarantee will go away, and that probably something that Europeans need to think about anyway in the long run. And of course, it will have an impact on Ukraine. But you know, I mean, I think it's unlikely that Trump, you know, will continue to support, the United States will continue to support Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, he thinks it'll bring peace. I don't know that that's what Orban's hoping for. I don't know that will happen, even if Trump wins. I mean, I just don't think that all of a sudden the situation in Ukraine is solved. So I don't know. I mean, even in terms of what happens in Ukraine, what the implications would be. But the Europeans should be worried that the United States is not a reliable partner. And then, of course, I don't know in terms of I guess I'm not in favor of Trump and so forth, but I think we can also overstate the threat. Not that he's not a real threat to it's not going to be the end of, I don't believe, of democracy in America if Trump is elected. But there would be, I presumably have some, I mean, I don't know what kind of impact it would have on Europe. Would it really strengthen the right wing, which is already kind of on surging in Europe? I don't know. It could, I guess. It could be, but the real concrete thing in my mind is the security guarantee and how Ukraine is handled.
Botond, my question for you is, what will a new Trump administration mean for Europe and specifically for Hungary? And also, I'm curious, how is Brussels preparing for a Harris presidency?
How much time do I have? Thank you. I would sign on what you have said regarding the narratives of radical right and how that would reinforce radical movements in Europe. In Brussels, the talk is a bit different. In what regards, most serious industrial players and market players are worried about an IRA 2.0, whether that is coming from Trump or Harris. Actually, the industrial eye is seeing rather a continuity of US protectionism growing in critical fields of digital technology and the clean and net zero industry, in the language of Brussels. So that is a clear worry. And I have seen several discussions and papers about what Trump tariffs would mean, but whatever an IRA 2.0 could mean for the up-and-coming European industries that President von der Leyen again wants to put in the focus of her second presidency. There is also the rather general conclusion that the pivot to Asia will not stop. So Europe, I mean, most rational players behind the curtain are not sleeping with any illusions that the United States is not continuing its pivot to Asia. And whether that is quick with the Trump presidency or more diplomatic with the Harris presidency is something that we have to take into consideration. So consistency of US policy maybe at that level is more worrying for Brussels. Finally, let's just put that card on the table that how strong the incoming administration can be depends on the election results of the Congress. So we will see if the Congress flips. So if the House will go to the Democrats and the Senate to the Republicans, that's the assumption currently, but it's again not granted. So if a Harris presidency doesn't have the Congress, so there are a couple of metric solutions there, and let's see how that is turning out. One word about Hungary. Last week, there was a conference there. I had the chance to discuss with Heritage Foundation representatives. And among many other points, there was one that was consistent, that Hungary should not expect even a Trump presidency to accept the China policy of the country, which I think is an extremely important message. And the China policy of Hungary is not independent from its Russia policy. I don't want to go into this rabbit hole. We can discuss it later. But if I have to pin one thing for the Trump 2.0 regarding Hungary, that would be the one.
In the recent years, the relationship between Trump and Orban has become a huge focus in America. And
I wanted to comment on that.
Of course, yeah.
Because I have a contrarian take, so I would like to just take just about the China thing. So I guess I want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm not convinced. I know that this is the standard thing you hear in Hungary that, Trump's China policy, this and that, and Orban's, friendship with China, and this is going to cause a lot of trouble. And I'm just not actually convinced that it would be more. But I mean, I guess I think that the Hungary-China policy should be embedded in the European China policy. And you will find, I don't know exactly what a Trump administration would do. They obviously would want to have Europe not trade or so much with China, but I mean, the Germans have a trade with China. I mean, it's a broad thing. I mean, and how much does Hungary stand out with other European countries? And I mean, it's different. I mean, whatever, you got Chinese policemen and walking around in Budapest or whatever, and I don't think the Trump administration cares about that, or would care about that. And whatever, there's like these loans from China and so forth. But okay, those sort of nitpicky details, I just don't think that that's going to be a concern of a Trump administration. A Trump administration would want to have Europe reduce its interactions with China, but how effective will that policy be? And so I mean, I could be wrong. I might be underestimating the extent of Orban's relationship with China, but I just don't. I'm just not convinced that it's going to stand out. Hungary will get special attention because it's interacting with China or has any more than whatever Germany or other parts of Europe. So I mean, that's just my contrarian take.
So I really don't want to take the mic from you, but I feel I have to respond. So one signature case from the last week, and I guess this is making the difference in the eyes of any administration, shall it be Trump or Harris, if I would be the head of any security apparatus in Washington, is that Hungary is not only influencing its own China decisions, whether there are battery factories or not. The point in the case is that in the last week, we learned that the 1 billion Chinese credit line that Hungary signed was actually in 50% going to Macedonia, to the party of Gruevski, who is accused of corruption, and this happens to be an asylum seeker here in Hungary. So when Hungary is helping to project Chinese soft influence across the region, especially in the Balkans, that is up for grabs in the geopolitical game, I guess this is an issue. And we see the same pattern actually potentially with some Russian sources going to Milorad Dodik in Bosnia We have seen just the last week that Hungary was sponsoring potentially Vox, so the Spanish Radical Party, but the history is long with Le Pen, with helping Pellegrini to meet the Russian president's man before the election after the killing of the journalist. So this list is rather long. So Hungary is not a player alone. Hungary, and especially Orban himself, is playing on a network. And that is making him a big difference, while I absolutely agree that there are much more China industrialist friends in Germany, Spain, or Italy.
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. I'm just taking the contrary. Sorry, we should. But I mean, well, okay, never mind. I forgot. Let's just go to another. So I mean, if we could just go. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't know, but I'm not. I'm just. Yeah. I don't. Anyway,
let's just give the speech. You said we have to give the speech 10 years before. So let's just be cautious about how Hungary...
Orban is just like, I mean, he just doesn't know what he's doing? Or what's Orban's calculation? Because, I mean, he knows he's dealing with China, right? He knows that Trump, who he loves, speaks a lot, you know, wants to limit Chinese influence. I mean, maybe Orban is just sort of like, doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, I wouldn't rule that out, but maybe he's got a different kind of calculation that, well, you know, we just got to watch what they do and not what they say. And how much it is, how effective and focused is the Trump administration going to be on curtailing Chinese influence in Chinese influence in Europe anyway? I mean, but I don't know. Okay.
Speaking of Orban, we have read a lot of interesting articles lately on his relations with the Republican Party's Trumpist segment. And I'm wondering if nationalist or far-right parties, far-right figures will become a bridge. Will they have a connecting role between both sides of the Atlantic? This is a question for you, Nathalie.
So I think they will try, but I'm not sure they will succeed. What do I mean by this? So who are the right-wing leaders that we're talking about? So there is Orban, and then there are others. So in the case of Orban, he will try and he will presumably have very warm reception. He already does, in fact, by Trump. I think, you know, it's interesting the way in which, you know, in the debate with Harris, Orban is the only sort of international leader that was even referred to by name by Donald Trump, and twice or something. You know, I mean, it's really quite remarkable considering, frankly speaking, Hungary's size, right? So, you know, I think Orban is the one that will be warmly received, and it's not just the relationship with Trump, it's also the relationship with J.D. Vance. I mean, I remember when I was in Munich back in February, sort of on a panel with J.D. Vance, and I learned backstage that after Munich, the only other capital that he was going to was Budapest. So there's obviously something there. However, it is very clear that Hungary's role in Europe has been dramatically diminished. Right? I mean, one only needs to look at the portfolio that Hungary has received yesterday in the European Commission to realize how much it has diminished. So if you are to be a bridge, you presumably need to have interlocutors on both sides. And, you know, in the case of Orban, very clearly there is an interlocutor on one side. I'm not sure there are any left on the other side. Then you have other leaders, other right-wing leaders that may try and do exactly the same thing. And again, you know, sort of let me speak as an Italian here. I'm absolutely sure that my own prime minister is going to try and play that role. Now, whereas, you know, in a sense, Orban's mask has come off a long time ago, I think Meloni's mask is only beginning to come off now. And she still has interlocutors in various European capitals that still think that she's, you know, sort of decent or can be domesticated. They're, by the way, completely wrong. But anyway, that would take us in a different direction. So she would still, you know, she would have interlocutors on one side. I'm not entirely sure that, unlike Orban, she would have an interlocutor with Trump. Because in a sense, precisely because she's been playing, you know, this kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde game, and she has a sort of fairly good relationship with Biden. I'm not, and then of course there's the question of defense spending. Yeah, I mean, we get to, you know, we fast forward to January of next year, and you know, which are going to be the medium to large European countries that will be spending significantly below 2%. Well, kind of Italy is the only one. And so I'm not sure that Trump would actually want to have a Meloni, if you like, as an interlocutor. So, you know, to sort of come to a conclusion, I think, you know, we're in a situation in which either on one side or on the other, I can't think of anyone that would actually be able to represent a bridge between the two. As I said, that's mean that they will try. I'm just not sure that for one reason or another, anyone will really succeed.
Thank you. David, could you shortly react to Nathalie's words? And I would like to ask a closing question as well from all the panelists. I'm wondering what you think the public view on transatlantic relations is in the US. And then I will ask the European panelists about the same question, but what the situation is in Europe.
So you want this question here? You know, I don't really, I mean, I don't know. It's true. I live in America and I talk to Americans and so forth, but so I guess, but I don't really know. I guess I think that, I mean, I think that there is a kind of, I don't know how strong it is, but there is a kind of growing trend towards isolationism in America. I mean, I think probably among the elites, the political elites, people understand the value or the importance of this transatlantic relationship. I don't think it's really, it seeps down to the level of the population, and probably that's true on the right or the left. So I don't, you know, I just think it's, you know, I think people don't appreciate it so much. That's my view, and it kind of, the success of it depends on the elites or maybe educating people or something like that.
Thank you, Botond.
There are excellent polls measuring how Hungarians think about the relationship, also in Hungary and by Globsec as well. And there is a deterioration in how Hungarians appreciate the transatlantic relationship, just like there was a hijacking of the Russian public opinion since 2014. So it was not beginning with the war. So it is possible to artificially and very speedily manipulate public opinion in these questions. I have seen a number on how the Republican and the Democratic voters think about this. And apparently when the question was, do you want America to be on the global stage? Approx 80% of the people, of the Democratic voters said yes, while 40% or 39% of the Republicans agreed only. Which is already a very good number, actually. But 50-something% of the voters of the Republicans say that they are just having mixed feelings about the conduct of Trump. So actually, the Republican camp is not so united. And I guess it's also important to recognize that the US is just a huge country with a huge electorate with two parties. So it is a popular party on both sides, embracing quite a lot of diverse opinions. So practically, I guess Brussels does appreciate the relationship. It could not manage it very well in the last year or year and a half with the Trade and Technology Council. That is the platform for negotiation between the Commission and the US authorities. There was a stuck in this negotiation procedure last month. They again couldn't resolve it. So I guess there is a lot to be done. And the expectation of President von der Leyen did not come true because she wanted to have her administration ready before the US election, so by the 1st of November. But apparently, a friend of Viktor Orbán, Janez Janša in Slovenia, managed to derail this plan by not nominating in time again the second commissioner candidate. So we see everything in work. This influence is there. It's not only positive influence that Hungary has in the EU.
Thank you. Nathalie?
So in terms of sort of, you know, how European public opinion looks at this, well, firstly, I mean, I would say the obvious thing, which is I don't think there is a European public opinion on transatlantic relations. And I think, you know, different geographies, different political inclinations will lead to very, very different sort of emotions and opinions. But I think, you know, broadly one can categorize them into three. You certainly have one strand, which of course are, in a sense, the believers, where anxiety, I think, is the dominant sort of feeling. You know, there is a sense of, hey, we're going to be abandoned, and we may actually be abandoned one way or another. And let's just hope there's going to be the least traumatic way of being abandoned, or rather sort of becoming increasingly detached. So I think anxiety is definitely very dominant. That anxiety can either lead to paralysis, or it actually can lead to what do we need to do about this, which then of course takes you in other completely different directions. I still do think that there is a fairly large segment of the population where still there is a sort of strong strand of anti-Americanism, where actually that, you know, the risk or the threat of that detachment may not necessarily be viewed negatively. But I think broadly speaking, what is dominant probably across all of opinions is really a kind of sense of bafflement and kind of lack of understanding of where exactly it is that the US is headed.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for audience questions, but I would like to thank our experts for joining us today, and for the Budapest Forum organizers for having us here in beautiful Budapest.